Welcome to True and Unpolished, the podcast, a Cuss Culture production. Through this podcast, our intention is to uplift, inspire, and amuse.
Let's get authentic. Well, hello, everybody. Happy holidays. Today is Christmas Day. And in the spirit of Christmas, we want to talk about goodwill toward everybody. Mary, tell us about goodwill toward everybody.
So, several years ago, 5 years ago or so, 4 years ago, I was going through, basically my relationships had fallen apart, lots of relationships, my marriage, and then the friendships that kind of went with that relationship started to fall away too. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand what was happening and coming up with stories in my mind about why, and assuming the worst about people.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend tell me at one point, the reason people were behaving the way they were was because they just didn't care. They couldn't care. And it wasn't because they weren't caring people, but their attention was focused on their own life, not on what was happening in mine. And so during that time, Lydia, you were the person that I called, and so I would call you and I would tell you all the things and every little detail, and these stories that were partially true based on what was happening and partially probably made up in my own mind and trying to figure out what was happening, what the truth was. And so the thing that you said to me that has stuck, and I frequently go back to when I struggle in my relationships, is the phrase that you said, which was, Mary.
Let's say it together. Assume
good
will. Okay, now you say it by yourself because that probably didn't translate. Go ahead.
Well, you just said, Mary, what would happen if you assumed goodwill?
Right. Because you're talking about, people's motives and why they were doing the things they were doing and why they were having the behaviors they were having. And that
I was assuming the worst.
Right.
And so you helped me kind of turn that around. And that one, phrase, that one statement, assume goodwill, really helped me shift. And the more that I was able to kind of focus on that, take a breath, and okay, how do I assume goodwill? The more I was able to do that, the more the pain would lift and subside.
Right. And at that time, and I honestly cannot remember who gave me that phrase. I'd love to think that I came up with it in my brilliant mind, but I don't know that that's true. But I do know that my husband and I began using that. So when I passed it on to you, it was something that he and I literally wrote on cardstock, assume goodwill. And we would put it, there was one in each room of our house. And I think it was probably because we went to couples counseling for a little bit. So it was probably our couples counselor. And it radically shifted things for us because, so often, and I think we do this almost instinctively, well, of course, right? We project onto other people what they're thinking and why they're doing what they're doing.
Right.
And
we make assumptions.
We're assuming anyway. So if we're assuming anyway, what would happen if we just assumed goodwill? And assuming goodwill is, in my experience, was often enough to shift. So even if I wasn't coming from my highest, truest, most loving self, if my husband was able to assume goodwill, his response was undefended, unguarded, and it caused me to drop my guard and my defense.
Right.
So, assume goodwill has the power to shift.
Well, I guess what I was thinking about is the idea of I know myself, and most of the time I don't have an illicit,
Right.
hurtful agenda.
That's
Do
correct.
you?
No.
So
Only Tuesdays.
So I can make an assumption. I mean, maybe I can make an assumption that most people aren't evil or out to get me or out to destroy my life.
Right.
Because I know myself, and I know my intentions aren't that.
Right.
So why wouldn't I assume that other people's aren't either?
Yeah. And I think that, it's the same principle as the just like me practice from Pema Chodron. And I know I've talked about it a lot, but it's such a great practice and is very helpful, because when you begin to judge somebody else, you can say, just like me, they are coming, they want to be happy. Like I use this all the time during this election and just this time of divisiveness. And when I, would come across someone that disagreed with me ideologically, instead of judging, I can say, well, just like me, they think they know the right way forward, just like me. They feel strongly about the person that they want to win this election, and so it's that assuming that this other person who disagrees with you ideologically is not, in fact, an evil genius that is out to destroy the world. But they're just like me, hoping, believing that they know a way forward.
Well, I think that goes along with, the idea of, it doesn't go along with the idea of original sin, but, the way that I was taught was, we're all sinners.
Right.
And, it's by the grace of God that we are saved.
Yes.
And so that, that's not the way that what I believe is that we are good at our core.
Yes.
And God or the universe, life created us and we're good.
That's right.
And that's right. So I think, our ability to assume goodwill would have to start with, are you still believing in the idea of original sin, or are you leaning more towards the idea of we really are at our core, we are good,
right? And the way I believe that it's the way that I believe that it is that anything that someone would label sin or term sin is simply the things that we've added on that cover up our goodness. And those things that were added on were coping strategies. They were ways to not feel fearful and frightened in the world. And so those parts are not us. They are just, in fact, us getting confused about who we are and who other people are. So yes, this, and that for me, in order to believe it about others, I had to first acknowledge it and embrace it for myself,
right?
And that can be difficult, because I remember having, my prover would give me all the proof and evidence that, I was not good, and all of these ways in which I was, quote unquote sinful or had fallen short. And oh gosh, I just want to stop saying the word sin. But anyway, we're going with it. And so, but when I came to see, oh my gosh, I really was just trying to survive in the only way that I could, and that goes along with one of my favorite quotes, which is people are always doing the best that they can with what they have from where they are. So with the tools that they have, with the consciousness that they have, we're all doing the best that we can. And so when we embrace that idea of we are basically good, then we can have this notion of assumed goodwill. So, certainly it's very important in a moment such as this where, there's such divisiveness.
Yeah.
And I think too, this is the holidays, right? And so today, perhaps you're seeing family, you're with your spouse, your children, your in-laws, or Zooming them, or they wanted to get together and you didn't because you disagree about the best way forward. And so there's, tension there. So what would happen on a day like today if we assumed goodwill?
Well, that's when miracles happen.
That's right. That's when the beauty happens.
That is when the beauty happens. I think, I think another kind of point is that I was thinking about when you were talking is that we all just want to be seen. We all just want to be loved.
Yeah.
And, so I think, making that assumption,
Right.
that even when people act out and do things that are hurtful,
Right.
so assuming goodwill doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take abuse or
Right.
continue allowing people to hurt you. But what it does mean is being able to kind of look beyond the behavior and assume that their behavior is trying to do is help them be seen.
Be seen or be safe. And that actually brings up a good point because one of the ways in which we can take care of ourselves and love ourselves and show up for ourselves is that we ask that of the people in our life. I'm going to ask that you assume goodwill.
Right.
And because I deserve that. I deserve for you to assume goodwill from me. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be perfect, but I think it's a way of drawing a healthy boundary, right? And loving ourselves.
Right. And I mean, why are we in relationships?
Right.
And so I think, if it's a relationship that you choose to be in, then that is certainly a reasonable thing for me to ask somebody that I'm choosing to be in a relationship with.
That's right.
Don't assume the worst.
Yep.
Assume that I do want the best.
Right. And actually, my husband and I were talking about this today because this was in the Zim Zum of Love, the Rob and Kristen Bell book. It is that assume that the other person is just trying to figure it out. Like when you're in an argument and a disagreement, both of you assume that the other person is just trying to figure it out too,
Right.
And that, shifts it so completely. Like if we can just take that pause in a moment of discord or a moment where we are disagreeing with a loved one and say, wait a minute, clearly we're both struggling because we're both in an argument right now. Right. So, and we both are trying to figure it out and find a way forward. And sometimes that looks really messy and sometimes it looks like not goodwill, but in fact, I believe the vast majority of the time, what we're trying to do is just get ourselves out of the argument. Like, how do we get out of this? And,
Right.
And often, this so reminds me of something else I was listening to Pima Chodron say. And that was that we are, none of us wants to suffer, and yet our behaviors and our ways of going about avoiding suffering are not in accordance with that desire not to suffer. In fact, we actually are creating our suffering. And so I get this image when we're talking about arguing, and it's kind of like this flailing around, like trying to get ground beneath your feet, because, arguments, disagreements, they just feel bad. They just feel bad. Conflict feels
so then what we do is, some of us put our head in the sand. That's or right. Avoid the conflict at all cost.
Right.
And I don't think that assuming goodwill is about avoiding conflict. But I do think if we come from a place of assuming goodwill, then we're going to lessen the frequency or intensity of our conflict.
Well, one of the things,
but that doesn't mean we don't need to deal with it.
That's right. And I'm so sorry I kept trying interrupting, because this is so in line with, I keep talking about my husband today, you guys. He and I realized that what was modeled for us when it came to conflict was, it was yell and scream or flee,
right.
Fight or flight. And so those really are the first two tools in our respective toolboxes when it comes to conflict, right?
Right.
And I am avoidant. I go. You know what I mean? That's what I do. I go. I shut down. And that was one of those moments where he and I realized that, this happened over Thanksgiving, because we were trying to put up the Christmas lights, and it's just bad. Have I already told you guys this story? I'm sure I didn't.
I don't think so.
It feels like this wouldn't be a forum in which I would tell this story. That's why I think I haven't told you. But here you go, everybody.
Here we go.
Well, hang on your hats. So yeah, we were trying to put the Christmas lights on, and I have very specific memories around Christmas lights from my childhood, and they are not positive ones. And we were attempting to understand, like, where do we start? Do we start it from the bottom, or do we start it from the top? And, and I said, I really don't think we're supposed to start it from here. I think we're supposed to start it from here. And he got upset, like his tone got really loud. Well, it felt really loud to me. Sometimes things feel loud to me that aren't necessarily loud, but I could feel it begin to like rise. And I said, you know what, you do it. And I stopped, set him down, and walked out of the room. Right. And I came back. He hadn't done it. He said, you do them. So I did them. And so we unpacked that later on. And what what he was assuming was that I was angry because he disagreed with the way I wanted to do it. And what was happening for me is that I was sensing that conflict coming on. It was, pushing a button from my childhood within me. And so I was doing the avoidant thing. And even more than just that, in that disagreement, he realized that all of these times in our relationship where I go, he had assumed that it was about him, and that he was taking it personally, like it was personal to him. And he realized, oh my gosh, this is just you using the tool you got.
Well, I think, that's a whole nother discussion about sensitivity.
Yes.
So, and that is one of the ways that we protect ourselves when we get triggered.
Right.
And so maybe we can have a conversation about that. But because when we get triggered, then all all of this spiritual goodness is out the window.
That's right.
You know, and I mean, assuming goodwill and all that
That's
junk.
Right. That's right.
It's just, yeah.
And that's why, honestly, you know, just in closing, the reason why we wrote it on cardstock and put it in every room in our house is because we recognize that in moments where we're triggered, it's difficult to remember things like assume goodwill. And that's why you want to give yourself those kinds of reminders. And I swear this is the very last thing, because I know it's time to go, because you guys got ham to eat and eggnog and all that stuff. So we're going to go. But this one I want to say, paint markers. I think they're called China markers, but like the ones you can draw on the windows with, right? I have a box of them now, and I write messages on my mirror now. And then when I need a new one, I undo it and I write another one. So there you go, everybody. That's your.
You can also use expo markers for that.
Maybe that's what they are.
Well, no, paint markers are, but paint markers would be safe for windows, but expo markers are
on mirrors.
Like dry erase board markers.
This is so interesting. Let's discuss. Okay, this has been so much fun. Happy holidays to you, dear Mary, and to all of you. Thank you so much for listening. You have been listening to True and Unpolished, the podcast. Let's see what happens next.